July 7, 1928, Chillicothe, Missouri. A small bakery on Elm Street runs a machine nobody in America has ever used commercially before, and by mid-morning the loaves coming off the line are already cut into neat, even slices wrapped in wax paper stacked in the window. The local paper calls it the greatest forward step in the baking industry. It's not a chemical, it's not a preservative, it's just a saw and a wrapper, and it changes what bread is allowed to be. Because the second you slice a loaf, you triple the surface exposed to air and mold, and the only way to sell it a week later is to change what's inside it. So what exactly went in? If you like food investigations built only on real labels, real regulations, and real recall notices, subscribe now. Everything ahead comes from public documents you can look up yourself, and by the end you'll never pick up a loaf the same way again. Picture the aisle. You've got maybe 40 seconds, a cart with a wobbly wheel and a kid asking for the one with the cartoon on it. And in front of you there are two loaves side by side. One is pale, soft, obviously white. The other is a warm, nutty brown with visible flecks, and the bag says wheat. Maybe it says multigrain. Maybe it says made with whole grain in a friendly rounded font on a background the color of a wheat field. You reach for the brown one. Almost everybody does. That's the whole point of the brown one. Here's what the United States regulations actually say. There is a federal standard of identity for whole wheat bread. It lives in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 136, Section 180, and it is blunt. To be called whole wheat bread, the dough has to be made from whole wheat flour, meaning the entire wheat kernel, bran, germ, endosperm, all of it. Not mostly, not partly. That same Part 136 is worth a moment on its own, because it's older than most of the brands sitting on that shelf. It also contains a standard of identity for plain white bread, 136.11, which spells out what may go into it and in what proportions, and even sets rules for how much moisture the finished loaf may carry. These standards were written in an era when the federal government believed a consumer had a right to know that a word on a package meant one specific thing. That belief survives, in writing, for a shrinking list of terms. Whole wheat bread is on the list. Almost nothing else in the bread aisle is. But a loaf labeled simply wheat bread is not covered by that standard. Wheat bread just means it's made from wheat. All ordinary bread is made from wheat. White flour is wheat flour. It's a true statement that tells you nothing at all. So where does the brown come from? Sometimes from a genuine portion of whole wheat flour blended into white, sometimes from molasses, and in plenty of products, according to the ingredient panels printed right on the bags, from caramel color. That's a listed, legal coloring agent, and when you see it on a loaf that's marketing itself on wholesomeness, it is telling you something important. The color and the flour content are two separate decisions made by two different departments. Raisin juice concentrate does the same job in some formulas, and it gets to sound like fruit while it does it. So does a dark malt extract. None of these are contraband. They are simply the answer to a question the bakery asked itself, which was not how do we make this more nutritious, but how do we make this read as more nutritious from 3 feet away in fluorescent light. Now multigrain. Multigrain means more than one grain, that's it. It carries no requirement that any of those grains be whole. A loaf can be built on refined white flour, get a scattering of cracked wheat and oats and millet on the crust, and be truthfully labeled multigrain. 7 grain, 9 grain, 12 grain, same logic. The number counts grain types, not nutrition. And notice where those visible seeds usually are. On the outside. Topping seeds are applied after shaping, which means they contribute texture, appearance, and a small amount of fat and fiber, and they contribute a great deal of confidence. A crust that crunches reads as rustic. Rustic reads as unprocessed. The eye is doing the arithmetic, and the eye is not good at arithmetic. And made with whole grain is the slipperiest of the three. Made with whole grain is true if there's any measurable whole grain in there. 1% qualifies. The phrase is doing emotional work, not nutritional work. Its cousins are everywhere once you start looking. Made with real honey baked with oats, a touch of whole wheat. Every one of those is a statement about presence, not proportion. Proportion lives on the back. There is one front-of-pack phrase in the US that does carry legal weight, and it's worth knowing because it's the exception. The FDA authorized a health claim linking whole grain foods to reduced risk of heart disease and certain cancers, and to use it a product has to meet a defined whole grain content per serving and stay within limits on fat and sodium. That claim has specific wording. It is nothing like a wheat field printed on plastic. There's a third-party mark you'll see on a lot of these bags, a stamp from the Whole Grains Council, run by the nonprofit Old Ways. That one at least has published thresholds. Their basic stamp requires at least 8 grams of whole grain per labeled serving, and their 100% stamp requires that all the grain in the product be whole grain, with at least 16 grams per serving. That's a voluntary industry program, not a government rule, but the numbers are public and consistent, which already puts it ahead of a picture of a wheat field. Here's the part that gets under my skin, though. Bread isn't a snack food in the American diet. It's infrastructure. Public nutrition surveillance in the United States has repeatedly identified yeast breads and rolls as one of the single largest contributors of sodium to the diet, not because any one slice is salty, but because people eat several slices a day, every day, for decades. The Centers for Disease Control has published that ranking, and bread sits at or near the top of it. It's the same story with added sugars in the savory aisle. Nobody thinks of a sandwich loaf as a sweet food. Look at the panel. And bread carries that weight in another sense. Since 1998, U.S. regulation has required that enriched grain products be fortified with folic acid, a public health measure aimed at neural tube defects. Enriched flour also carries added iron, thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin, a policy that dates back to the wartime 1940s. So the refined loaf you're side-eyeing is also, deliberately, a delivery vehicle for nutrients the country decided everyone should get. The bread aisle has been a public health instrument for 80 years. It just doesn't advertise that part. So the everyday mistake isn't buying bad bread. It's buying bread on a glance, using the 2 cues our eyes evolved to trust, color and texture, in an aisle specifically engineered to reproduce both of those cues chemically. The fix is 1 sentence long, and we'll build the whole rest of this on it. The front of the bag is an advertisement, and the back of the bag is a legal document. Only one of them is required to be true in detail. Let's open the legal document, not the ad, the panel. Start with the ingredient that begins almost every American sandwich loaf: enriched flour. 4 words that hide an entire industrial process. Enriched wheat flour is defined in the same part of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 137.165. It's white flour, meaning the bran and germ have been milled away, with specific nutrients added back at specified levels: thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, iron, and folic acid. That's why the panel often reads like a chemistry set in parentheses right after the word flour. Those aren't mystery chemicals. Those are the vitamins that were removed during milling and legally restored afterward, in some cases because of a public health rule we'll get to. Now the bigger structure. There is a federal standard of identity for plain bread, rolls, and buns at Part 136, Section 110. At its core, it requires flour, water, and a leavening agent plus salt in most practical formulations. And then it lists optional ingredients that are permitted. That optional list is long: shortening and fats, milk and milk derivatives, egg products, sweeteners of many kinds, yeast nutrients, dough conditioners, enzyme, mold inhibitors, emulsifiers. A loaf can carry a dozen additions and still be, legally, plain bread. Here's the historical wrinkle most people never hear. For decades, foods that met a standard of identity didn't have to spell out every optional ingredient on the label the way non-standardized foods did. The standard itself was considered the disclosure. That changed as American labeling law tightened, and the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990 pushed the system firmly toward full ingredient declaration on packaged foods. The panel you can read today is the product of that fight. But there's still a doorway. It's called the Incidental Additive Exemption at Part 101, Section 100. If a substance is present in a finished food at insignificant levels and has no technical or functional effect in that finished food, it does not have to be declared. Processing aids live there, so do some components that came along inside another ingredient. This is not a scandal by itself. It's how carryover works in every food code on Earth. But it means the ingredient list is a list of what functions in the final loaf, not a complete inventory of every molecule that touched the dough. Now let's name the functional players you'll actually see. Calcium propionate or sodium propionate. Mold inhibitor. Propionic acid occurs naturally in some cheeses. The salt form is added to bread to buy days of shelf life. Without something like it, a sliced loaf in a warm kitchen has a very short career. Monoglycerides and diglycerides. Emulsifiers and specifically crumb softeners. They interact with starch and slow the firming of the loaf, which is why day 4 bread still bends. DATEM, which stands for diacetyl tartaric acid esters of mono and diglycerides, and sodium stearoyl lactylate, often written SSL, permitted under Part 172, Section 846. Dough strengtheners. They let weaker or cheaper flour hold gas and rise tall in a fast process. Ascorbic acid. Yes, vitamin C, but here it's not a vitamin claim. It's an oxidizing dough improver. It's listed as an ingredient because it functions. L-cysteine, affirmed in Part 184, Section 1271. A reducing agent that relaxes gluten so dough machines faster. Its permitted sources have included keratin from feathers and, historically, other keratin materials, which is why it has a reputation online that outruns its actual dose. Today much of it is produced by microbial fermentation. The label just says L-cysteine. Azodicarbonamide, permitted as a dough conditioner and flour bleaching agent under Part 172, Section 806, at a maximum of 45 parts per million of the flour. Hold that one. It gets its own chapter. Soy flour, calcium sulfate, ammonium sulfate, monocalcium phosphate, mostly yeast food and dough buffering. Vital wheat gluten, extra protein bought in a bag to prop up a flour that couldn't do it alone. And then the clean label workaround: cultured wheat flour, cultured dextrose, vinegar, raisin juice concentrate. These are real preservative systems produced by fermenting a food substrate so the resulting organic acids do the antimicrobial job. They're legitimate. They're also chosen partly so the panel can avoid a word that scares shoppers, while the front of the bag says no artificial preservatives. Which is, and I want to be precise here, completely accurate, and also completely engineered. Bread has a paper trail. Let's walk it. Start with the machine. Otto Frederick Roeder, a jeweler from Iowa, spent years trying to build a commercial bread slicer. An early version and his drawings were destroyed in a fire at a plant in Monmouth, Illinois, in 1917, and he started again. The machine that finally worked went into the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri in July 1928. 2 years later, Continental Baking put sliced Wonder Bread into national distribution, and the sliced loaf became the American default. Then, in January 1943, the United States banned it. Claude Wickard, Secretary of Agriculture and head of the War Foods Administration, ordered a halt to the sale of sliced bread effective January 18, 1943. The reasoning given publicly involved conserving wax paper, steel for slicer parts, and holding down bread prices, since sliced loaves needed heavier wrapping to stay fresh. The public reaction was ferocious. Newspapers ran letters from furious homemakers. And on March 8, 1943, less than 2 months later, Wickard rescinded it, acknowledging the savings hadn't been what was expected. That's the whole life of the sliced bread ban, 50 days. Jump to advertising. In 1971, the Federal Trade Commission brought a complaint against ITT Continental Baking over the long-running Wonder Bread campaign, built on the line that it helped build Strong Bodies 12 Ways. The FTC's position was that the advertising implied Wonder Bread had unique nutritional properties when it was, in nutritional terms, a standard enriched white bread like its competitors. That case became a landmark in American food advertising law, and it's the reason claims of that shape mostly vanished from bread bags. Now the additive that rewrote the rules: potassium bromate. It's a flour treatment agent that strengthens dough and gives a big, reliable oven spring. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classified potassium bromate as possibly carcinogenic to humans. Group 2B. The United Kingdom prohibited it in 1990. Canada, the European Union, Brazil, China, and others followed with their own restrictions. In the United States, it was never federally banned, but in 1990, California added it to the Proposition 65 list, which meant products containing it sold in that state needed a warning. Warning labels are commercially poisonous, and a large share of the American baking industry quietly reformulated rather than print one. Then, in October 2023, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 418, the California Food Safety Act, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and distribution in California of foods containing potassium bromate, brominated vegetable oil, propylparaben, and red dye number 3, with the law taking effect January 1, 2027, a state law reaching into a federal gap. Azodicarbonamide has a similar arc, with a louder ending. It's permitted in the United States as a dough conditioner and flour bleach, but it's not permitted for that use in the European Union or Australia. In 2014, the food writer Vani Hari ran a public petition aimed at Subway over its use in sandwich bread, and the nickname that stuck was the yoga mat chemical, because azodicarbonamide is also used as a blowing agent in foamed plastics. Subway announced it was removing the ingredient. Within months, other major American chains and bakers announced the same. The regulation didn't change. The market did. And then there's the additive that got added on purpose by law for the public good. In 1996, the Food and Drug Administration issued the rule requiring folic acid fortification of enriched cereal grain products, with mandatory compliance from January 1, 1998. It was aimed at neural tube birth defects. Published surveillance from the Centers for Disease Control afterward reported a substantial decline in those defects in the United States. If you want the clearest case for reading the fine print with an open mind, one of the most consequential additions in the history of the bread aisle is a B vitamin nobody notices. Recalls rounded out, and they're rarely about the exotic ingredients. In October 2016, Bimbo Bakeries USA announced a voluntary recall of certain bread products across multiple states after the possible presence of small pieces of glass, with the notice stating the fragments may have come from a component in one of the production lines. In January 2017, Flowers Foods announced a voluntary recall covering several bread brands because of undeclared milk, tied to whey present in an ingredient supplied to the bakeries. Glass and an undeclared allergen, not chemistry, manufacturing. All right, bag in hand. Here's the sequence I'd use, and none of it requires trusting me, a brand, or a stamp. Rule 1. Read the first ingredient and stop pretending the rest matters more. Ingredients are declared in descending order by weight. If the first word is enriched wheat flour or unbleached enriched flour, that is a refined white flour loaf, no matter what color it is or how many seeds are glued to the crust. If the first words are whole wheat flour or whole grain wheat flour, you're in a different product. Everything after position 1 is arguing about margins. One wrinkle worth knowing. Water is often a large part of a loaf by weight, so on some panels water sits at position 1 or 2. Don't let that throw you. Read down to the first flour and treat that as your answer. And watch for a flour listed as wheat flour with no qualifier or stone ground wheat flour, which sounds ancient and means refined unless the word whole appears. Rule 2. Count the sweeteners as a family. Manufacturers can list sugar, high fructose corn syrup, honey, molasses, malt syrup, dextrose, and fruit juice concentrate as separate line items, and each one individually falls further down the order. Add them in your head. If 4 sweeteners appear on a savory sandwich loaf, that loaf is sweeter than its position in the list suggests. Then check the nutrition panel for added sugars in grams, because American panels now break added sugars out separately from total sugars. That number is harder to game than the ingredient order. A small caution on that line. A little sugar in bread is food for the yeast and browning for the crust, and it can be almost entirely consumed during fermentation. What you're hunting is not the presence of sugar, but the size of the number in grams on the panel, per slice, multiplied by how many slices your household actually eats. Rule 3. Find the serving size before you believe any number. This is where most people get fooled, and it isn't even hidden. Some panels are built on 1 slice, some on 2. Slice weights differ enormously between a thin sandwich loaf and a thick bakery cut, and a lighter slice makes every number look better. Do it per 100 grams if you can, or at minimum compare grams per slice, printed right there in the serving size line. This is also where the thin sliced diet loaf reveals itself. Have the slice, have every number keep the same recipe. Nothing false has been printed. Something true has been arranged. Rule 4. Look at fiber and protein together per slice and be unimpressed easily. Refined loaves that add isolated fiber ingredients can post a respectable fiber number without containing much whole grain at all. Nothing illegal about that. Just know which one you're buying. The names to recognize are things like inulin, chicory root fiber, polydextrose, resistant maltodextrin, powdered cellulose, and oat fiber. Some people find the first few unfriendly in quantity, which is its own reason to read. Rule 5. Learn the emulsifier cluster on site. Mono and diglycerides, DATEM, sodium stearoyl lactylate, calcium stearoyl lactylate, polysorbate 60. One of these is normal in industrial bread. 3 or 4 together tell you the loaf is engineered for softness and shelf stability across a long distribution route. That's a fact about logistics, not a verdict on safety. Next to them, you'll often find the enzymes, sometimes grouped under a single word like enzymes with nothing further. Amylases, xylanases, lipases, and in gluten-boosting formulas things like vital wheat gluten and ascorbic acid used as an oxidizing agent rather than as a vitamin. Enzymes are processing aids that stop working once the loaf is baked, which is why the panel can be so vague about them. Rule 6. Find the preservative system and identify it honestly. Calcium propionate is doing a job. So is cultured wheat flour. So is vinegar. A loaf with none of the 3 and no sourdough acidity is a loaf that expects to be eaten fast or frozen. Sorbic acid and potassium sorbate turn up too, usually in tortillas and buns rather than sandwich loaves. Rule 7. Read the allergen statement twice, both the contains line and any may contain or produced in a facility line. In the United States, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004 requires plain language declaration of the major allergens. The FASTER Act, signed in 2021, added SESAME as the 9th major allergen effective January 1, 2023. The contains line is regulated. The may contain line is voluntary and unstandardized, which means its absence proves nothing. And if you're avoiding gluten rather than an allergen, know that the FDA's gluten-free claim is defined, less than 20 parts per million. That is a number, not a mood. Rule 8. Check the net weight, not the loaf silhouette. Bread bags are gusseted and puffed, and 2 loaves that look identical on the shelf can differ by several ounces. Divide price by weight, not by loaf. Then divide by slice count if the bag prints it. Many U.S. stores post unit price on the shelf tag, and for bread it is frequently the single most useful number in the aisle. Rule 9. Understand the date. In the United States, apart from infant formula, date labels on packaged food are not federally mandated safety dates. Best if used by as a manufacturer's quality estimate. Many bakery loaves also carry a colored twist tie or clip key to the delivery day, an industry convention rather than a legal requirement. Useful for freshness, meaningless for safety. Bread also stales fastest at refrigerator temperature because of starch retrogradation, so the fridge is the worst place for it and the freezer is the best. Rule 10, and this is the one that separates a shopper from an inspector. When 2 products make the same front-of-pack promise, compare their back panels against each other rather than against your hopes. The honest version of a claim and the engineered version of the same claim look identical from 3 feet away and completely different from 6 inches. And a note on other countries, because a lot of you aren't shopping in America. In the United Kingdom, the bread and flour regulations require that non-wholemeal wheat flour be fortified with calcium, iron, thiamine, and niacin, and the government has consulted on adding folic acid. Wholemeal has a defined meaning there. Sourdough does not. Across the EU, labels must give the quantity of an ingredient highlighted on the front, and allergens have to be emphasized in the ingredient list itself, typically in bold, which is a genuinely useful design choice. Hold that thought. Now here's the strange part. This is the case where a food safety law, written entirely with good intentions, made a widely available loaf of bread contain more of the thing it was protecting people from. In April 2021, the United States enacted the FASTER Act. Its central provision was straightforward. Add sesame to the list of major food allergens, joining milk, eggs, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soybeans. Effective January 1, 2023, Any packaged food containing sesame had to declare it in plain language, and sesame became subject to the same allergen control expectations as the other 8. That mattered because sesame had been genuinely hard to track. Before the law, it could legally hide inside collective terms like spices, natural flavors, or tahini-based blends, and studies had estimated that well over 1 million people in the United States have a sesame allergy, with reactions that can be severe. Families who'd spent years guessing at unlabeled sesame in buns and breadsticks and wraps had won something real. Then the shelves changed in a direction nobody in the advocacy world had asked for. Because of how allergen rules work in practice, a bakery that doesn't intend to put sesame in a product but can't guarantee its lines are free of sesame traces faces a problem. Sesame seeds are small, they scatter, they get into dust, they ride through shared equipment. Cleaning a large plant to a verified sesame-free standard is expensive and in some layouts close to impossible. But there's another route, and it's fully legal. Deliberately add a small amount of sesame flour to the formula, declare sesame on the label, and the allergen is no longer an uncontrolled contaminant. It's an ingredient, disclosed, compliant. Think about the incentive structure for a second, because it's the whole engine. An undeclared allergen is the leading cause of food recalls in the United States. A declared one is a line of text. If your choice is between an expensive engineering project with residual recall risk and a formulation change that costs almost nothing and eliminates the risk on paper, a plant manager does not need a long meeting. And that is what a number of large American bakers and restaurant chains did. Reporting through late 2022 and into 2023, documented sesame flour appearing in the ingredient statements of bun and bread products that had never listed it before, at chains and in packaged bakery lines. Consumer advocacy organizations, including the Center for Science in the Public Interest and allergy patient groups, publicly criticized the practice, pointing out that the practical effect for a sesame-allergic child was fewer safe products, not more. Parents described the specific cruelty of it. A bun that had been safe for years, same brand, same bag, now off the list. The Food and Drug Administration weighed in directly. In a public statement in November 2022, Commissioner Robert Califf said the agency did not support the practice of adding sesame to products that hadn't previously contained it, and noted it made it more difficult for sesame-allergic consumers to find safe foods. But the agency also acknowledged the practice wasn't a violation of the law as written. That's the whole tension in one paragraph: discouraged, criticized, and legal. Legislators in several states and members of Congress floated fixes. Advocacy groups pushed for rules that would treat intentional addition purely to dodge cleaning as an adulteration issue. Some bakers reversed course under public pressure. Others didn't. And if you're an American reader who's noticed sesame appearing on the label of a plain white hamburger bun you've bought for a decade, that's not your memory failing. That's regulatory arithmetic printed on a bag. There's a second oddity worth putting next to it, from the other side of the Atlantic, and it's about a word rather than a seed. Sourdough. In the United Kingdom, there is no legal definition of the term as applied to bread. The Real Bread campaign, run by the food charity SESAME, has spent years documenting loaves sold as sourdough that were made with baker's yeast, added acidifiers, flavorings, or vinegar to mimic the tang, and dough improvers to shortcut the long fermentation that gives real sourdough its structure. The campaign coined a name for it: Sour Fox. They've published surveys of supermarket and chain bakery products, filed complaints, and pushed for an honest crust act that would legally define terms like sourdough, fresh, and artisan in bread labeling. As of now, no such law exists in the UK. The campaign has gone after neighboring words too, and this is where it gets genuinely absurd. Freshly baked can lawfully describe a loaf that arrived at the store frozen and part-baked, then spent 20 minutes in an in-store oven. Artisan carries no minimum standard of handwork. And in-store bakeries in the UK are not obliged to give a full ingredient list on unwrapped loaves the way a packaged one must, which means the least documented bread in the shop is often the one that looks the most authentic. Other countries went the other way. France's 1993 decree on bread reserved certain terms, so that pain mason must be kneaded and baked on the premises, and boulangerie carries obligations about where the bread was actually made. Germany maintains detailed published guidelines defining hundreds of bread types, so the idea that words on bread can be legally pinned down isn't utopian. It's just optional, and the UK opted out. So you can have a loaf whose ingredient list includes yeast and an acidifier, sold under a name that most shoppers understand to mean a slow, natural ferment with nothing but flour, water, salt, and wild culture. The label isn't lying. The label is using a word that nobody has been required to define. Put those two cases side by side, and you get the real lesson of the bread aisle. In the sesame case, a strict rule produced an outcome its authors didn't want. In the sourdough case, the absence of a rule produced an outcome shoppers didn't expect. The ingredient list told the truth in both. It just needed you to already know what to look for. Which brings us to the money. Follow the money and the ingredient list stops being mysterious. Every strange word on that panel is solving a cost problem. The biggest one dates to 1961, in a village in Hertfordshire, England. Researchers at the British Baking Industries Research Association, based at Chorleywood, developed what became known as the Chorleywood bread process. The idea was to eliminate the long bulk fermentation that traditional bread needs and replace it with intense mechanical energy. Very high-speed mixing does in minutes what hours of resting used to do to gluten structure. To make that work, the formula changes. More yeast, a hard fat, an oxidizing improver such as ascorbic acid, extra water, and enzymes. The mixing itself is the point. The dough is worked to a defined amount of energy per unit of mass in about 3 minutes, often in a partial vacuum or under pressure to control the size of the gas bubbles, which is what gives factory bread that famously even, fine, pillowy crumb. Bulk fermentation drops from 3 hours or more to essentially nothing. A loaf can go from flour to wrapped and labeled in a shift. The payoffs were enormous for industry. You can use lower protein wheat, including domestically grown British wheat rather than expensive imported hard wheat. You cut hours off the production cycle, which cuts labor, floor space, energy, and working capital. And the finished loaf holds more water, which matters more than most people realize, because bread is sold by weight and water is the cheapest ingredient in the building. There was a national strategy dimension to it as well. Post-war Britain wanted to lean less on imported North American wheat, and a process that made weaker homegrown wheat behave like strong wheat was, in effect, an agricultural policy delivered through a mixer. Most published accounts the Chorleywood method, and processes derived from it, came to account for the large majority of factory bread in the United Kingdom, and variations on the same logic spread through industrial baking worldwide. The food writer Elizabeth David and later, campaigners like the Real Bread campaign have been openly critical of what it did to British bread. The industry's counterargument is equally documented. It made bread cheap, uniform, and reliably available. Both things are true. That's the whole story of the modern loaf. So what actually changes when a loaf gets cheaper? The flour bill barely moves, because flour is a surprisingly small slice of the retail price of packaged bread. The real levers are time, water, and protein. Time is money, so you shorten fermentation, which means you lose the flavor compounds that slow fermentation creates. You replace them with sweeteners and sometimes with flavor ingredients. Water is free, so you push hydration up and use emulsifiers and enzymes to keep the crumb from going gummy and to stop it firming for a week. Protein is expensive, so you buy weaker flour and add vital wheat gluten and dough strengtheners to hold the structure. That's it. That's the entire cheap loaf equation, and you can read every part of it in the ingredient panel once you know what each item is compensating for. And there's a distribution cost hiding underneath all of it: waste. Unsold bread is a direct loss, and in many markets it comes off the supplier's books, not the store's. Every extra day of shelf life is money recovered. That is why softness and anti-staling matter so much more to a bakery than flavor does. The panel isn't optimized for your mouth. It's optimized for day 5. Then there's what happens above the factory floor. In December 2017, Canada's Competition Bureau confirmed it was investigating an alleged arrangement to fix the retail price of packaged bread. Loblaw Companies and George Weston Limited publicly admitted participating, and in what's known as immunity cooperation, disclosed the conduct, saying it had run for roughly 14 years. Loblaw offered customers a $25 gift card. In June 2023, Canada Bread Company pleaded guilty to 4 counts of price fixing and was ordered to pay a $50 million fine, described at the time as the largest price-fixing fine in Canadian history. Related civil litigation and further investigation continued after that. 14 years on bread in a country where bread is not a luxury. It isn't unique to Canada either. Bread's history is full of price scandals precisely because it is the item people notice. Britain's medieval assize of bread regulated the weight and price of a loaf for centuries, and the phrase baker's dozen is usually traced to bakers adding a 13th loaf so they couldn't be punished for short weight. When something is a staple, someone always tries to shave it, and someone always has to write a rule. There's a chemistry story on the cost side too. Acrylamide forms naturally when starchy foods are cooked at high temperature through the reaction between asparagine and reducing sugars. It's found in the crust of bread, in toast, in coffee, in fried potatoes. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies acrylamide as probably carcinogenic to humans. The European Union addressed it in Commission Regulation 2017/2158, which set out mandatory mitigation measures and benchmark levels for various food categories including bread. In the United States, the FDA issued non-binding guidance for industry in 2016. Practical mitigation for bakers means controlling bake color, adjusting formulation, and in some cases using the enzyme asparaginase. Another ingredient with a purpose you'd never guess from its name. The UK's Food Standards Agency ran a public campaign on the same chemistry, summarized in the memorable instruction to aim for golden rather than dark brown when toasting. And salt. In the United Kingdom, sustained voluntary salt reduction targets, driven by the Food Standards Agency and campaigners including Consensus Action on Salt and Health, singled out bread specifically because it was the single biggest contributor of salt to the British diet. Published analyses reported meaningful reductions in the salt content of UK bread over that period. The tactic was to lower the target gradually, in steps small enough that the palate adjusts without anyone reaching for a different brand. Salt in bread isn't only flavor either. It tightens gluten and slows yeast, so cutting it means re-engineering the dough. Nobody voted for it in the aisle. It happened in the formula. Cheap bread isn't an accident, it's a design brief. So what do you actually do with all this on a Tuesday, with a real budget and a real kitchen? First, buy on the panel, not the promise. My working rule is simple. If I want whole grain, the first ingredient must contain the word whole, and the front of the bag should say 100% whole wheat or 100% whole grain, because that phrasing is doing far more work than made with. If I'm buying a plain white sandwich loaf, because that's what the household eats, I buy it honestly and don't pay a premium for brown coloring. Second, understand what actually goes wrong with bread, because 2 completely different things get called going bad. Staling is not spoilage. It's a physical process called starch retrogradation. After baking, the gelatinized starch molecules gradually recrystallize and the crumb turns firm and crumbly. Here's the part that reverses a habit most people have. Retrogradation runs fastest at refrigerator temperatures, roughly just above freezing. Putting bread in the fridge makes it go stale faster than leaving it on the counter. It does slow mold, which is why the habit exists. But if mold isn't your problem, the fridge is the worst place in your kitchen for a loaf. Below freezing, retrogradation essentially stops. So the correct answer is the counter for a few days or the freezer for the rest. Freeze it sliced in the bag you bought it in, ideally inside a second bag or wrap to control freezer burn. Pull slices out one at a time. They toast straight from frozen. A whole loaf can be revived by wrapping in foil and warming in a moderate oven, because heat temporarily reverses some of that starch crystallization. It only works once, so do it before you serve, not the day before. On timing, commercial sliced bread with a mold inhibitor typically holds acceptable quality for something like 5 to 7 days at room temperature, and in the freezer at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Published food storage guidance generally puts quality retention around 3 months, longer for safety, but with declining texture. Bread without preservatives or genuine long-fermented sourdough behaves differently. Real sourdough's acidity slows mold naturally, and a proper crusty loaf stales gracefully into excellent toast. Third, mold. This is the one place I'll be firm. The United States Department of Agriculture's guidance on moldy food is that soft, porous foods should be discarded, not trimmed. Bread is the textbook example. What you see on the surface is fruiting bodies. The network underneath extends through the crumb where you can't see it. Cutting off a fuzzy corner of a soft loaf does not remove the colony. Throw out the loaf. And don't sniff it up close, because inhaling a plume of spores is a genuinely bad idea for anyone with respiratory sensitivity. Also, mold spreads inside a closed bag, so one affected slice compromises the rest. Fourth, storage hardware. A bread box works and there's a reason. It keeps humidity moderate, enough to slow the crust drying out, ventilated enough to avoid the condensation that invites mold. A sealed plastic bag on the counter goes soft and molds sooner. A paper bag alone dries out fast but keeps crust crisp, which is right for a crusty loaf and wrong for a sandwich loaf. Fifth, the actual prepper layer, and I want to be careful to keep this practical rather than dramatic. Sliced bread is not a storage food. It's a fresh product with a shelf life measured in days. If your interest is a resilient pantry, bread's role is to be made, not stored. That means the storage items are flour and grain, salt, fat, and leavening. White flour, kept cool, dry, and sealed, generally holds around a year of good quality. Whole grain flour goes rancid much faster because the germ contains oil, which is why it's often recommended to refrigerate or freeze it. Intact wheat berries, kept cool, dry and protected from pests, store for years and grind fresh. Instant dry yeast keeps a long time unopened and should live in the freezer once open. Baking powder and baking soda give you soda bread and quick breads without any yeast at all. And then there are the shelf-stable bread relatives that actually do keep. Crackers, flatbreads with low moisture, hardtack, and canned brown bread of the kind that's been sold in New England for well over a century. What they all share is low water activity or a sealed sterile container. Everything else is a countdown clock in a plastic bag. Buy the loaf you'll eat, freeze the half you won't. Here's what stays with me. In 1928, a jeweler from Iowa built a machine that cut bread into slices, and that one convenience forced the entire industry to answer a question it had never faced. How do you keep something soft and safe and cheap for a week? Almost every word on that ingredient panel is somebody's answer. Some of those answers were quietly brilliant, like the folic acid. Some were quietly commercial, like the caramel color. None of them were hidden. They were printed on the back of the bag the whole time, in 6-point type, waiting for someone to turn it over. So turn it over, that's the whole skill. If this was worth your time, subscribe, because we're doing this to the entire supermarket. And tell me in the comments which one you want next: canned tuna, breakfast cereal, or olive oil.